Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
Why only have your debut feature playing at a film festival when you can have your first two features be playing at a film festival? And if you can hear the sound of my voice, you must be in the seats with, once again, my name is David Voigt. I am your host and moderator for this venerable podcast where we talk to a wide variety of industry professionals, not only about current projects, but about what got them into the business, insight going forward, the whole nine yards. And as always, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify Podcasts, and you can find everything archived on our YouTube channel. And obviously, if you want the latest and greatest movie reviews and news and everything else in between, please visit us at intheseats.ca. Today, we talk with writer-director Amelia Moses, who has not one, but two films playing at the Blood in the Snow Film Festival, which is kicking off tomorrow night on the Super Channel. If you're not already signed up, I recommend you get on it lickety-split. And these are two really fascinating films with a bit of a through line, but they're very interesting. They're very psychological. It really gets down to sort of the core of wanting that can happen in the horror genre and how easily relatable it is. And we talk about the films, and we talk about so much more, and missing out on the festival experience. And, well, that's enough of me. Let's go listen to Amelia. All right. No, I guess, obviously, first off, congratulations, not only on one, but both films going into bits. That's a huge thing. And, I really did love them both. They're both really, because there's a real psychological element to the horror that we don't necessarily get a lot of. Now, I'm kind of curious from your perspective, and I think this applies probably more to Bleed With Me. As a horror storyteller, is it sort of the psychological part that you want to lean into more as opposed to sort of spraying the viscera across the screen as sometimes movies will do?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you so much that you took the time to watch the films and that you like them. And yeah, it's kind of surreal to have two films in the festival, but it's really exciting. And to answer your question, I think so. Like, to me, I really see, obviously horror can cover a wide spectrum of things, but I think the horror I'm interested in is when it comes from an internal place.
Yeah.
It kind of becomes a manifestation of what's going on internally for a character or a person. So I think that's kind of fed into my approach with both films, is like, how is the horror an extension of the anxieties or insecurities or fears of the main character?
No, absolutely. And especially when it comes to independent sort of genre filmmaking, sometimes filmmakers will try to do too much with too little. Both these films are obviously working on a budget, and they felt very sort of constrained, but in the right way. And did one sort of lead into the other? Because while there's a different writer and they're both different movies, there is a through line there.
Yeah, that's completely by coincidence, I guess. I guess the through line is kind of my approach to horror and what I'm interested in. But when I did read the script for Bloodthirsty, there was some kind of parallels with like dead rabbits and stuff that I was like, oh, this is maybe why they want to hire me for this film. Because there was definitely some kind of funny overlap. And then I think the fact that Lauren Beatty, who plays Emily in Bleed With Me and who plays Gray in Bloodthirsty, I think even having her in both films kind of brings a connection somehow. And I didn't expect both films to come out so close together or to kind of have their festival run so close together. They were actually shot a year apart. And I only came on to Bloodthirsty 2 months before we shot the film.
Okay.
So I was really kind of thrown into it. And so I didn't have that long, like with the script. So the script was, pretty developed already, like when I got involved and we were ready to go into production. So I think those parallels kind of come a little bit from maybe just my sensibilities as a director. They come from Lauren. And then I think just the fact that people are seeing them back to back, not maybe literally, but, within the same kind of short span of time, So I think there's something there. The fact too that Bleed With Me, some people are kind of seeing it as a vampire movie because it does draw on some of that imagery. And then you have maybe a more overt choices with Bloodthirsty for the werewolf stuff. So there's a kind of monstrous element that's like continuing through the two of them.
Now, I mean, the other thing that I really did enjoy was, and this is something that the horror genre has always been sort of at the forefront of. These are both female-led films. They're female-driven films, and I mean, I'm kind of curious. And I mean, I know this is a cliche question to ask, but for you, does it come down to story? Does it come down to wanting to be able to have a sort of strong feminine lead, or something? Like, I'm trying to figure out the right way to word this, because horror has always been sort of at the forefront of giving us compelling and strong, interesting female characters, which I think we get in both of these films.
Yeah, totally. There's a huge tradition of that, of having female leads. I mean, on top of that, usually those female leads are white too, but that's kind of a issue within all of kind of cinematic history. But yeah, I mean, one of my favorite books is House of Psychotic Women by Kiera Janice, where she kind of touches on how a lot of the kind of exploitation horror films from the 70s like really like resonated with her and her own kind of issues with mental illness and stuff. And so I think there's something really interesting, because obviously those films are dealing with kind of complex women, but at the same time all through a male lens.
Yeah.
And I'm not someone who thinks that like only women can tell women's stories and vice versa, because I think that's stupid and it's gonna like not create good art. But there is something to be said of women behind the camera too, just for kind of a diversity of thought and all that kind of stuff. I think that the same thing goes for films outside of horror as well. And just in general, like the more kind of voices you have, the more kind of interesting and current things are going to feel, which I think is really important. So for me, having female leads is not to kind of be like, well, this is what the world needs, or this is feminism. It's just coming from a place of like, that's what I know, right? As a woman, and looking at my own, insecurities or anxieties that are kind of not exclusively tied to gender, but sometimes they are. You can't deny that you exist in the world a bit differently depending on those things. So I think that's where that comes from. It's just like, write what you know kind of thing.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of that comes through in Bleed as well, because I mean, it's this intense character drama, and there's these characters with this longing and these obsessions that they're not sort of comfortable with, and sort of really being able to sort of pull those through. And I mean, it's really kind of fascinating to watch those kind of character dramas unfold on screen. And I'm kind of curious, because obviously Bleed was more of an independent sort of you did it yourself kind of production versus Bloodthirsty, where you said you got hired onto the shoot. Is there a preference for you when it comes to this, or is it like, I'm kind of curious how you approach the job differently, especially on an indie shoot where you're the writer, you're director, you're doing everything?
Yeah, I mean, the approach to both films was quite different for exactly what you're talking about. The fact that I'd written Bleed With Me and had written the script over kind of a course of a year and a half. When I got on set, I was like, I know these characters so well. I know what I want to say so well, because I'd written it myself and it all kind of come from me. I was really, really excited to shoot something that I hadn't written before, because it felt like something new. I also think that collaboration is a really strong part of filmmaking. I love the idea of someone else's idea that I then bring to life on screen. I think that's a really interesting process. But yeah, with Bloodthirsty, I think it was the fact that I, was dropped into it quite late before shooting. And then on top of that, it wasn't my script. I felt like I had to get to know the characters and the intentions on set versus like in pre-production, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was just different. It was a different process. And I think it was more kind of figuring out as you go along sort of thing, versus something I'd spent a long time really preparing for. So that was kind of the key difference, I guess, between the two films in terms of a directing approach.
Well, and it's true, because I mean, really, when you think about it, I mean, directing a film, there, like, you're using so many different muscles in your mind and your body, and you're really trying to sort of push the boulder up the hill, as it were. I mean, if that's the right analogy to use. And
Oh, for sure.
because and people really don't, sort of, at least from the outside looking in, don't quite understand sort of the differences that can really arise depending on the shoot. Obviously, even with Bloodthirsty, you're working on a smaller budget, but it's not something like Blood, where Bleed, where you had no money.
Mhm.
And I guess this kind of dovetails into my next question, because, like you said, you've got two features. You didn't expect them to have their festival run really kind of at the same time, and you're kind of being denied sort of the festival experience. And I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, how do you feel about seeing not only your films, but all the films that are playing at BITS, to be able to sort of hit something like Super Channel? Because on one end, obviously it's great, you're going to have a bigger audience, a bigger market, but on the other side, it's like, darn it, I wish I could have seen this with a packed house.
Yes, completely. And that's been a difficult thing. I remember when I found out that Fantasia was going to go online, because that's where Bleed With Me premiered. I knew it was the right decision for the festival and for the city and everything, but it was definitely a hard blow.
Yeah.
Because it's my first film. It was the world premiere. We were lucky to get into such an amazing festival. That means a lot to me too. I've been involved with Fantasia in some capacity for the last 4 or 5 years. And so I was so stoked to premiere there. And so much of the time, as a filmmaker, you're working towards that goal of being in the dark room with the audience and the big screen and the good sound and all that kind of stuff. That's really where, that's cinema, right? And obviously that's changing. And even when cinemas open back up again, I think the landscape in terms of exhibition has obviously shifted because of all this. And it was shifting before that too, but I think everything's kind of come to light in a different way in terms of streaming's probably going to become some films might not play a cinema run, might not play a theatrical, whereas they might have before. I think that's all going to shift. But I think a lot of the festivals have done a really great job at pivoting and trying to think of new ways to keep audiences engaged. And I think Blood in the Snow is a perfect example of that in terms of teaming with Super Channel. And all the festivals too have really done a good job at keeping the filmmakers in mind too. I remember when South by Southwest was canceled, and obviously that was so last minute, and that was really the kind of a really massive shift, obviously, when that festival canceled. But there was some confusion afterwards about they were going to do an online thing to do with Amazon, and then some filmmakers were kind of saying, well, this is going to impact our distribution options because it's going to be available everywhere, and it wasn't really a good system that was set up because they were scrambling, understandably. But the festivals that I've been a part of have been very aware of distribution opportunities as well, and making sure the fact that even though it is an online space, that they're still following some kind of protocols to make sure that filmmakers get distribution opportunities, because that's such a huge part of going to these festivals. And so you have to make sure that filmmakers still get that chance, to think about the life of the film beyond the festival run.
For sure. Now, does sort of the shift in the landscape that we're in the middle of as we speak, and we don't know exactly where it's going to settle out, sort of change your focus as a storyteller? Because you may make other films in the future and they may not get a theatrical run. Do you know, when you're focusing on sort of your next story, can that come into a factor, or do you just have to focus on telling the right kind of story that you want to tell?
I think you just have to focus on what stories you want to tell, because the reality is too, it's unless you believe in the film, it's going to be really fucking hard to make. And then on top of that, it probably won't be very good. So I really feel strongly that you have to believe in the story and stuff, because you have to put so much of yourself and hard work into it. So for me, it's just thinking about, what stories I want to tell and what characters I want to explore. And, I'm kind of the mindset that also, the where a film exists obviously can impact how people receive it. So it is important to the director, but there's also something to be said of you go in and you tell your story, and it's someone else's responsibility to, get it out there, right? Because that's not entirely part of the job. So I think in terms of thinking about new or interesting ways to distribute films, I think obviously falls more on producers or distributors. But I think people are trying their hardest, and I think there might be some cool stuff that's going to come out of this, different ways to think about it. I haven't gone to the cinema in a long time now, but I really miss it. I do love watching movies at home too, but at the same time, there's just nothing beats being with an audience. It really does have an impact. So I don't think that that's going to go away. It might morph, but I don't know if it's going to go away. I hope not. It's really fucking depressing.
No, that is depressing. And I mean, I don't think it will either, to be honest. But like you say, there's a lot of changes coming, and we're like for good and for bad, depending on how it all kind of shakes out. And I'm kind of curious because we live in such a day and age when there's so many movies out there, and there's so many, there's like, I don't want to say the word content because it feels like a dirty word, but there's so many films and TV shows and whatnot out there. You really do have to focus on sort of the storytelling to be able to sort of have a chance to rise to the top inside all of the noise. And for you, I'm kind of curious because as much as horror is, I love it. You love it. There's a lot of fans, and it's a very warm, embracing community. But at the same time, I'm kind of curious, are there other stories you want to tell maybe outside of the genre? Or do you see yourself right now, at least, as more of a horror film storyteller?
Yeah, I mean, I think horror is the sphere that I want to continue existing in. I guess if it ever gets to a point where it's limiting in terms of story, then for me, story always comes first too. So there's an idea that I have for a next project, and I was talking with a collaborator, and she was like, is this a horror film or not? And I was like, I don't really know, but this is the story I want to tell. So I don't want to put a label on it or try to force something in there just for the sake of it. It has to kind of let itself unfold. So I think for me too, like one worry I had with Bleed With Me was that it wasn't going to be received well from horror audiences because it wasn't like quote unquote horror enough, because it's definitely more character focused. It's not overtly like bloody or gory, but to me, that's not what defines horror. And I think a lot of people feel that way too, but I guess I was worried about that. But in fact, it's been the opposite. And so I guess I just never want to be limited by that label. Because to me, what I love about that label is it's very open. There's such a huge spectrum of things. And for me, horror is just like kind of a visual manifestation of those kind of internal struggles. So whether that's in the form of a monster or body horror or, whatever it is, that's kind of my approach to it. So that probably will stay the same for future projects.
Well, and I love that you say that too, because it's one of those things that people on the outside looking in don't necessarily click with, because horror fans always seem to be the first who were willing to sort of color outside the lines or accept someone coloring outside the lines when they're watching a movie. Like, why do you think that is?
In terms of people watching films?
Yeah, like in terms of the audience, because I've always found horror audiences are always a little more accepting of, like you say, it's still a horror movie, but maybe it's not horror by the traditional sense of horror that people would think about it as.
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer, because I feel like there is a lot of rhetoric sometimes like, oh, that's not a horror film. And obviously you have to draw the line somewhere, or else like everything is, and then that would be bullshit. But I think like the term psychological thriller really bothers me, because I feel like that's always thrown in to be like, well, it's not a horror, it's a psychological thriller. And you're like, okay, but what does that really mean? And then it's kind of suggesting that one is better art than the other. And I was talking with some friends recently where they described horror films as having to have gore and violence. And to me, I was just like, well, no, that I completely disagree with that statement, but I watch a lot more horror films than them in general. So I think there's kind of two sides to it. People who will embrace anything, and then people who like will go, well, that's not really a horror film or whatever. I don't know. I think audiences just are interested in seeing new things. And there's something about the way you can subvert expectations and tropes when you're utilizing them. So whether that's, vampiric imagery or cabin in the woods or whatever you're kind of drawing from, so many films have already done that, right?
Yeah.
And so to some extent you're like, oh, well, I don't want to just make the same thing, but then you can utilize those story elements to subvert things, right? Which I think is just so fascinating, because as soon as the audience sees, like, even if they just see a cabin in the woods, they have certain expectations immediately. Yeah. All it takes is that one shot. So I think that's like such a valuable tool, because you're utilizing the rhetoric and you're utilizing the cinema history to your advantage, essentially. So I think that's like a really cool thing. I don't know if that really answered your question.
But it does, though, because I mean, it really is almost a kind of curation, and especially for our business in general to sort of I don't want to say survive, because it will survive, but to be able to thrive again, there really does need to be a more conscious look at sort of the art of curation, not just in programming, be it for a streaming service, for a festival, but even for people in making films who understand sort of the history of the story that they're trying to tell and how they're trying to move it forward.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to say something, but then it immediately left my mind. So
no worries. Now, I guess just to start putting a bow on this, if you had a dream project, what would it be? Like money wasn't an issue, time wasn't an issue. What's the dream project?
I don't know. Sorry.
No, that's quite all right.
It sounds like such a boring answer. It makes it sound like I have no ideas. I don't know. I guess I've also existed so long. I mean, I'm still very new to all of this, but
right.
Being so conscientious of budget all the time. And I don't see that as a bad thing, because I think that limitations breed creativity. But I guess I've never really thought about an idea, without thinking about the money side of things too. Right. But I'll get back to you on that.
No worries. And I mean, but at the same time, that also kind of spins into something else I wanted to ask, because being a Canadian filmmaker and making a Canadian film, in the past, there has always been sort of a bit of a stigma in terms of, oh, it's Canadian, or it's a film that's trying to be Canadian, quote unquote. But especially in the past few years, and I think this is very true in genre films, that it has broken away from that, and it is sort of making stories that work on a global scale. And I'm curious about your perspective from that, from not only from being a filmmaker, but someone who has worked in Fantasia and being able to see a lot of Canadian genre films.
Yeah, I mean, Canadian films always have a bad rep, and it's almost like as soon as we find out they're Canadian, it gives a negative connotation, or viewpoint. But I think especially nowadays, like, film is just so global. Like, obviously with a film like mine, it's small enough, and in terms of everyone involved is Canadian. But so many films, it's like, well, the director's from here, but the cast is here, and this is the language, but it was shot here. And so I think the kind of way we define cinema by country is definitely shifting, because it is just really global, and sometimes the factors that dictate like what country it made this film could get really complicated when you have that crossover and kind of globalization. So yeah, I think sometimes it's good to maybe not let that factor in too much, and just try to see the film for the film.
And the film, I love that you just said that, because I mean, it really, at the end of the day, it has to be about the film, and the marketplace, like you say, is as such that it's so globalized and it's so big that as much as we do want to make Canadian stories and support Canadian filmmakers, we can't sort of focus on the Canadian part. We have to focus on the films and the filmmaker part, and that's how we move forward.
Yeah, like not letting that be the defining, like it's a factor, but not the defining factor. Though I think it depends on the filmmakers, because I think a lot of other filmmakers make things that are very specific to their life experience, that can be very tied to socioeconomic, background, or tied to where they grew up or where they live or whatever, where it does become a really important factor within the story. But again, the film then would be exploring that. So it would be on the screen kind of thing, But for me, my films are a bit more ambiguous in terms of they don't really try to tap into any sort of like realism too much. But yeah.
Now, I guess final question. What, if any, like if you can pin it down, is there one movie that was sort of the pivot moment for you to go, okay, I want to work in this industry. I want to make movies. I want to tell stories. And would that be your Desert Island movie if you had to pick one, or is there something else?
That's a good question. I love Desert Island Discs. So that's a good question. Yeah, I think like I knew I wanted to be a filmmaker like very young. I feel like it was probably Rear Window.
Okay.
When I watched that maybe at like 10 or 11, because I was very fascinated about who, like it says like Alfred Hitchcock presents or an Alfred Hitchcock film or whatever. And I was like, well, what makes it his movie? Like, what did he do that makes him the main guy? So I became very fascinated with like the director role. But I don't know if that would be my go-to film for Desert Island. That's a hard question. I'm gonna say The Shining.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, that could change. I feel like it's hard to answer those questions because films come in and out of your life so much. You know, you revisit them.
You're absolutely right. But I mean, I love that you mentioned those two movies because they really do fit the vein of the film in many ways. The films that you've made, because there's these psychological elements, there's these terrifying elements, but there isn't necessarily, you know, a cabin filled with blood. It's just a cabin sometimes, and it can be terrifying for other reasons too. But I just want to say thank you again for the time today, and I really appreciate it. And good luck at Bits, and congratulations again on the films.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a good chat.